The Goldenrod Protocols by James Oliver. Copyright 2023.
Chapter 2. It was 4:30. Jack's chest had been tense all day. He kept ruminating over his submission to Patricia and hating himself for it. But each time she came across his mind, he remembered the conversation at the bar 2 weeks ago. He kept replaying the memory. "Can you believe this?" he'd heard someone say. He'd kept his face buried in his link, feigning such focus on his game that he hadn't heard it. "Get your shit together, because things are about to get really bad." The man started to take a sip, but paused for an addendum. "I knew he was going to do this. I predicted it." Jack knew he couldn't avoid it. He'd tried to keep his eyes on his link, but they drifted against his intent to the TV long enough to see Moreau dissolve's commission on financial along the bottom. He took a breath and a sip of beer. "Well, looks like you were right. I've been saying it for 2 years. He'd rubbed his eyes as if it would regroup his many thoughts. The man leaned on the bar to his right. Jack had to twist toward him and slap his bracelet hand against his shoulder as if it were comfortable just so the man could see it. He remembered the man's trendy baby blue suit with asymmetrical lapels. One was notched higher on his chest and tinted green. The other was hued more toward lavender and sat lower. His Nehru-collared dress Henley was covered in large green and brown polka dots. The buttons were undone and his tie was loose, as had probably been the case all day. His hair grew straight out of his scalp but curled as it fell over his temples and the back of his head. He was a golden boy. He was probably about as old as Jack, but the nagging possibility that he was younger gnawed at his soul. "People never listen." "Thank you," the man replied, as if relieved to finally find validation. Jack had watched for a glimmer of hope that it would release him, but the man needed more. "I have a big circle, too, and I've been saying this was going to happen for 2 years, and I've seen lots of other people say the exact same thing after I started saying it. If anyone had listened, we wouldn't have to worry about this." Jack remembered worrying that the conversation would last much longer, and he'd be caught not knowing what they were talking about. He'd taken another glance at the TV, but all he got was "Devoted Leadership Holds Emergency Meeting After President's Announcement." "Well, maybe we'll get lucky and the Devoteds will stop him." The man was dumbfounded. "How? The Allegiants control the committees. What are the Devoted supposed to do?" It was just then that Jack had started to feel drunk. Fuck. He tapped his link to see the time. 6:56. He'd been there longer than he thought, but that was no excuse. He'd have to do his absolute best to pretend he knew what he was talking about while not in a clear and sharp state of mind. "Can't they pass a resolution?" was his best guess. The man's incredulity was so potent it had cocked his head off center. "Have you even been any paying attention at all?" He could never play the scene all the way through what happened next. Until that morning, the memory would start over. But today he found his thoughts drifting to Patricia next, and he wished he'd given her a piece of his mind. But there was no way out of these traps without feeling the familiar stirring of a captive soul. He finally shook away the haunting thoughts and watched the trainees play their games through the window above his desk. His big day was a disappointment. He showed the trainees around the factory floor, answered a few questions, broke for lunch, then sat them down for the assessments. He read a set of instructions. And that was it. 2.5 hours of nothing to look forward to. The prestige he'd imagined was never really there. The world was something that just happened around Jack, like a movie he had to watch and couldn't turn off. Most people were unlikable characters reciting pre-recorded lines he couldn't influence. Solitude in his work was his only solace. Normally, daydreams of hacking the algorithm, changing his code, and stealing the better life he should have had would keep him going. Sometimes he'd draw inspiration from his cramped Spartan control room and pretend the assembly floor was the engine room of a warship on the fronts. Whatever it was, he always came up with a way to ease from this life into the one he wanted. But there was no escape today. He kept noticing horrid little details against his will. The faded brown stitching on his chair, the smudged and greasy silver trim around his speckled gray desktop, and the filthy beige and black tiles on the floor. He never remembered these rich and putrid colors when he pictured the control room while was away from it. All he could ever see in his mind's eye was a rusted, disgusting shade of green. He fought to engage his mind despite the numbness crawling across it, but was getting restless. His wrist itched from his bracelet. It was time for a cup of coffee. Coffee breaks were rituals, little vacations Jack took each day. There was a small kitchen area in his factory wing, consisting of a refrigerator, a sink, a short linear counter with a coffee machine, and a small table where he could drink his cup of joe. But he liked crossing the skyway to the main building. It was like walking through an airport. He could pretend he was going somewhere. He often set a time to take one, a nice round number like 1 o'clock, or maybe 4:30 on long days like this. He'd watch the clock and let the anticipation build. When the right time finally came, he felt a tiny rush of excitement. He'd need to finish some mundane task like marking the last box on a maintenance form before slipping into the skyway entrance by the top of the steps to the factory floor. He relished each moment, selecting his size and brew, watching the stream of coffee fill the cup, stirring in the sugar, the soft, satisfying popping sound of the lid fitting over the rim. He savored the isolation, the silence of the empty room, the vending machine's quiet hum, the clip-clopping echo of his shoes on the floor. It was all very pathetic, really, but it was all he had. He wouldn't get to have any of those things this time. He walked into the break room and saw Tom staring at the vending machine with his mouth agape. Tom was a maintenance tech at the factory in his early 50s. He was a dope. He thought his red bracelet was kind of cool, and Jack had once heard him say something about farmers juicing cows to harvest milk. He was always a little disheveled, but just put together enough for work. His gray hair sat wherever it dried after his last shower. He didn't have enough ambition to imagine what it could look like if he ran a comb through it. "Hey, buddy." Tom selected a snack and eagerly waited. "Exciting day for you, huh?" "Oh yeah, I can't believe they pay me for this." Tom could be annoying, but Jack could relax around him knowing he wouldn't be haunted later by something he let slip. He placed a small cup under the dispenser and popped a Colombian dark roast bag into the little drawer at the top. Tom shook his head. "You know what your problem is?" "What's my problem, Tom?" Jack asked indifferently while he watched the slow drip turn into a steady stream. "You're never happy with what you got." Tom is a dogue. Jack was a kid when the armistice was signed, and the allegiance ceded the counties around most of the major cities to the rebellion at the Toronto Conference. The rebels had already begun to replace some of the old universities with the abbeys in some places years before, but now they had room to expand their new society and demand strict devotion to the better way without interference. Jack's mother wanted to move out of rebel territory, but his father refused to be driven from his home. "I don't have a master. No one owns my life," he once declared. "I don't live at anyone else's mercy." Jack's school held an assembly around that time where the teachers introduced the better way so he and his classmates could understand the changes to their classes and their lives. "Think of yourselves like cells in the body of a beautiful butterfly," they told the children. They each had their job to do, and it was super-duper important they all did it. Otherwise, the butterfly wouldn't be able to flutter around in the air so gracefully.